In this segment, we're going to be looking at the Great War, starting the war following the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and the buildup along Austria-Hungary and Germany by Russia. Please don't forget to use my website to find these notes, YouTube to find the videos, and your Edmodo accounts for assignments and for a copy of this video. Let's begin. To begin the war, we're going to talk about the Schlieffen Plan. Remember, Germany and France did not get along. Germany wanted to isolate France from its allies, and Germany, under Otto von Bismarck, had an alliance with Russia to prevent a two-front war between France and Russia. Unfortunately, when Kaiser Wilhelm II breaks the ties with Russia and Russia joins with France, that's exactly what they're going to get, a two-front war. Germany will be sandwiched in between France and Russia. So ultimately what you have is Germany here, France to the west, Russia to the east. You have a western front, you have an eastern front, and Germany is sandwiched right in between. That means they're going to have to divide their forces. Well, how did they get here? They got here because of a plan called the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was designed by Alfred von Schlieffen, who was a part of the government for Otto von Bismarck. And the plan was designed that just in case there happened to be an outbreak of war where they had to fight France on the west and Russia on the east, they needed a plan to do that. And that's what the Schlieffen Plan was, how to be the best we could be if that happened. The idea was to attack France to the west first and then Russia to the east second. And the idea behind this was that, one, Russia was geographically further away than France, and two, Russia, during the course of the Industrial Revolution, was far behind other European nations and railroads, and therefore that made them slower with getting resources to Central Europe. Now, what's going to happen is Germany will go strike France first at what we call the First Battle of the Marne. They didn't know it was the first battle back then, but that's what it ends up being, the First Battle of the Marne. And what happens is Germany strikes France first, goes in there, but when they get to France, they're pushed back, and they're actually pushed back because of reinforcements brought in by taxi cabs, of all things. Paris is going to send out some troops to push back the Germans, and they're going to slow down, one, because of the reinforcements, and two, because of fear of Russia coming in from their east. And so Germany is pushed back, and the Schlieffen Plan is delayed, and they cannot defeat France at the First Battle of Marne, and now when Russia goes to invade from the east, Germany must divide their forces in two. And what this results in is a stalemate on the Western Front. And the stalemate pretty much results in, for the majority of the war, a trench warfare where nobody really gains any lands throughout the course of the war. Unfortunately, it still doesn't take away the fact that it's going to be a gruesome, brutal war ahead. World War I is known for being a modern war. It completely changed how wars were fought before because of the increase in technology and new weaponry and new tactics. Let's talk about some of those things. As I said, World War I is known for the introduction of gruesome fighting, and it changes the course of future wars. One of the first things they had was trench warfare. If you have time, pause this video and Google search trench warfare to get some images and some graphs for how they were fought and who fought in them. The other thing that really added to it was new weapons. We're going to talk here in a moment about different types of new weapons, but feel free to pause and search for weapons used for the first time in World War I. They include things like the tank, poison gas, and the machine gun. All of these things made death much more efficient and convenient. And because of that, there was a heavy loss of life for both soldiers and civilians in this area. Civilians were just thrust upon the war and kind of got caught up in the middle of it. So if you have time, pause and be sure to search for trench warfare and new weapons during World War I. For trench warfare, you need to get an idea that this was pretty bad stuff. Soldiers fought each other from dugout trenches. And that's where they lived the majority of their days, in these muddy holes. They had barely enough room to walk, barely enough room to sleep. They were up all night with all the artillery firing. They had a big amount of what's called shell shock from all the artillery. It was a huge loss of life for very little gain. This is especially true on the Western Front. You would have battles where tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of men would die, and they gain a matter of hundreds of yards maybe. The big thing about trench warfare was the conditions. Poor conditions. You have rats the size of small dogs. You have disease in all kinds of different ways, from the flu to typhoid fever, all kinds of things that are going to be involved in this. You have mud everywhere. You have trench foot. I'm going to show you a picture of trench foot here in just a second. It's pretty disgusting stuff that would enable people so bad they couldn't do anything. And ultimately, you would have death all around you. In between the two trenches, you had an area called no man's land. And why was it called no man's land? Essentially, no life was able to live there. If you were caught up in that, you were caught in a crossfire of all types of just horrible things, from gun, rifle fire, machine fire, flamethrowers, poison gas, artillery, barbed wire. You did not want to be in that stretch between the opposing trenches. Let's look at some pictures here that I've just gotten from the internet. Or excuse me, these are quotes first. Quotes. These are quotes from your textbooks. First one here, the men slept in mud, washed in mud, ate mud, and dreamed of mud. So you kind of get a picture of what their living conditions were like in those trenches. The no man's land was a terrain of death. And finally, one soldier's perspective from your textbook, the trenches disappeared with earth. The air was unbreathable. Our blinded, wounded, crawling, and shouting soldiers kept falling on top of us and died splashing us with blood. It was a living hell. Here are some pictures. To the top left, you see trench foot, pretty gruesome, nasty stuff. And essentially what this is your skin just rotting out from you. Some of this would be so bad that they would have to amputate to keep the infection from spreading. Again, same thing. There's a top view of a different person's foot. You can see the boils and blisters that have come from trench foot. And then to the top right are the conditions of the trenches. You can see the man kneeling on his perch trying to save himself. He pokes his head up there. There's no telling how many bullets could fly his way. And down here in the middle, you can see the pathway, just how narrow it is. And also there are other trenches that wind back through here, and that's where they would sleep under the cover of these trenches to protect themselves. This is where all the rats, the disease, and just a huge mess of foul, muddy disgustingness would be. Take a moment and copy down this chart. These are talking about the new weapons. They were thought to make war quicker because of the gruesomeness, but ultimately what happens is they only made it more destructive and more deadly. We have poison gas, the machine gun, the tank, and the submarine. So pause and copy this down. Poison gas was in 1917 at the Battle of Somme, was introduced by the Germans. And this was introduced to draw soldiers out of the low-lying trenches. The gas would sink and they would have to get out. And when they got out, they would be shot at. So it was just a way to gain ground. And it was very lethal. There are two main types that they use, mustard gas and chlorine gas. They would seep into the mucus linings of your eyes, your nose, your mouth, and sometimes your ears. So a lot of the soldiers would be blinded by this, would choke on themselves, because of their mouths and esophagus being burned away by the gases. The other weapon we're going to talk about is the machine gun. The machine gun was a gun that was a machine that fired ammunition automatically. You could go from 300 to 500 rounds in a minute. That was much more lethal than the regular rifle, which could be maybe 10 to a dozen in a couple of minutes. What it would do was simply fire out a wall of bullets and just plow down anybody that tried to get against them. The British introduced the tank, and the tank gets its name because when somebody saw what they were building, they had asked what it was, and the kind of code and secret for it was, oh, it's a water tank, because that's what it looked like, a big hunk of metal. When in actuality, it was a vehicle that was armored to help with advances with trench warfare. And it was very successful and kind of turned the tide of the war for the Allies, especially later on the war in 1918. The Germans' biggest advancement was with their navy and what they called their Untersee boats, or a U-boat, and that was a submarine. Now, the other areas like Great Britain would use theirs, but the Germans had the best in their U-boats. And they used this kind of stealthy, silent warfare to fire on warships and to sink the British ships and isolate European allies from getting supplies, both militarily and resources like food and even clothing and medical supplies. Unfortunately for them, they use something called unrestricted submarine warfare and start going after every ship, no matter if it was tied to warfare or not. And that's going to be one thing that draws in the Americans at the end. And finally, the last slide, just looking at some pictures of the new weapons. The top left is an American portrait taken to show and present the problems, if you will, if you didn't wear your gas mask. This was a staged photo for American soldiers. Everyone but the man in the front left has a mask on and they're ready to fight, whereas the man in front left is demonstrating what would happen if he didn't have his mask on. The top right is some soldiers that are using a machine gun. It looks like a very large barrel, but that large barrel contains water to cool it because the ammunition would fire so fast the barrels would literally melt and bend and explode in front of the users. In the bottom left, you have the tank. You can see the kind of rounded shape, and that's why it's got its name, because they just said, oh, that's a water tank. In the middle, you have a biplane. Airplanes were really first used and changed the way we use our Air Force in World War I. Airplanes were first used as what we call reconnaissance, which means they go out and search the area from above. Then they started carrying bombs, sometimes literally in their laps, and throwing them overboard. Then they added guns to the front of them and had to time them up with the propellers, and they would have dogfights. And people like the Red Baron for Germany would have gruesome dogfights in battle, and he became a hero for Germany. And finally, in the bottom right, you have what some have called a Kaiser March, and this is the effects of poison gas on soldiers. All of these men here have been blinded in some way and a sight affected in some way from poison gas use, and they're using one another to walk through. You can see many of them have bandages on themselves, but poison gas was a deadly display of how far the world had come in its new use of warfare. That concludes our notes for today. Please make sure you're going on to Edmodo to keep up with your assignments, that you're keeping up with your in-class assignments, and feel free to use YouTube and make comments as you will.